Afternoon, everyone. Congratulations, you've made it through. We're at the final session of IGF-USA 2022. This session is a great way to wrap up the day because we're going to cover several of the topics that we've discussed throughout. In short, this session is about fragmentation. So one quick programming note. I'm afraid we've lost one of the panelists, Amy Stefanovic. We wish her well and hope to see her soon. I have with me John, Nazak, Eric, and Matt. Everyone's full bio is in the program. So let's jump in. So we want to set the stage a little bit about where we stand with respect to the net breakup or fragmentation. So first, let's just make a declarative statement. Fragmentation exists. It's happening all around us. It can take varying forms. Sometimes it's a little stealthy. Sometimes it's out in the open. We see the things that are out in the open, obviously the most clear, when governments take actions, for example, when Russia blocks specific content, when it blocked entire sites after the invasion in Ukraine. We see, and we've heard from Access Now, who tracks this, over 34 countries have taken, full or partial internet shutdowns, blocking all access. The more stealthy types of fragmentation we tend to see when it comes to cybersecurity. Things that we know about, espionage, using vulnerabilities, and tracking people, ransomware, things of that nature. Those don't just happen at a state level, but can also impact businesses, the public sector, nonprofits, and individuals. The fragmentation is not always the word that's used. When a government engages in what is ultimately fragmentation, you'll often hear them talk about digital sovereignty. And they'll describe this as a means of justifying actions that they're taking to serve their citizens in the way that they think is best for them. We see this most frequently and most recently in the area of privacy, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. From a U.S. perspective, a few years ago, the government decided as a policy perspective that in general, fragmentation was a bad thing and that we should work collaboratively with the rest of the world to try to limit fragmentation. We haven't had a ton of success there. Meanwhile, other types of fragmentation have happened. Again, privacy and the GDPR. And this has put the United States in a bit of a reactive posture. Rather than setting our own goals, we end up responding, our businesses, to laws established by others. So today is not the first time we've had a session on fragmentation at IGF-USA. In 2017 was the first time we really dove into it, and we talked about a paper that had been published in 2016 by William Blake, Vince Cerf, and Wolfgang Kleinmacher. In that paper, they established 3 types of fragmentation: technical, government, and commercial. Those monikers hold up, and we're going to continue to use that structure today as we look at the current state of fragmentation. Is this the new norm, and what's going to be happening? So we're going to begin today by talking about technical fragmentation. So we're going to start with Matt Larson. We have the benefit here of some folks on our panel who have worked directly in standards creation and implementing standards through businesses or the public sector. So Matt, why don't you start out with talking about a little bit about ICANN, and specifically, for those who don't know, this is the one area of the internet that does have some regulation and oversight and actual monitoring of technical standards. So tell us a little bit about what ICANN is doing and what your role is both in the creation and monitoring of standards.
Thanks, Melinda. I'm VP of Research in the Office of the Chief Technology Officer at ICANN, and I lead a team, a small team that researches the Internet's unique identifier systems that ICANN helps coordinate. So one of the things we do is participate very actively in the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, that develops Internet standards. You asked, what do we do to monitor? I think there's participating and actively contributing, but I think, when it comes to monitoring and enforcing standards, it's a different story. If you hang around in the IETF long enough, there'll be a bunch of people, they'll start arguing about something they're developing, and well, if we want this to be a requirement, how will we enforce that? And somebody will inevitably say, well, there are no internet police, because there aren't internet police, and there really is, unfortunately, no way to ensure that your protocol is enforced. If you hang around with enough network operators, you'll hear somebody eventually say, my network, my rules, right? The internet is a collection of networks, and each of those network operators get to do what they want. And, no one network operator can tell another network operator, well, you're not conforming properly. So on the one hand, it might seem kind of bleak. Well, there's no way to enforce standards, right? What do? We can put them out there and hope that people do the best to implement and to comply. But on the other hand, we do have the market, right? If you're a network operator and you run your network in such a manner that your customers can't connect to where they want to connect, or you're a vendor and you release products that don't interoperate with other products, you're not going to be as successful. Unfortunately, there's a big gray area between things that work perfectly and things that work so poorly they don't work at all. And the gray area is kind of where almost everything is. So it's not that the market, unfortunately, it can't perfectly weed out everything that doesn't work. But so I feel like that's maybe not the most positive answer to start our panel off, saying there's no way to enforce technology standards. But maybe someone else feels differently and can take the contrarian position.
Well, ICANN has several contracted parties, and they operate under these agreements. And the registry agreements, for example, list specific standards. So from an operational perspective, if you, let's say if you're testing DNS, you send out a probe, you're testing response times and round trips and availability. Is there any point in that juncture where you can confirm that all the relevant DNS standards can be in place, or do you just have to assume that they are because everything's working and no one's complaining?
I see what you mean. And indeed, the contracted parties have to comply with certain, there's a contractual language saying they have to comply with certain protocols, whether they be registration related or resolution related. And, we do things. We have, for example, an SLA monitoring system that checks that, for example, the authoritative name servers operated by registries are within the contractual limits for response time. The issue, the larger issue, and this is not an issue with ICANN, but with our industry, the DNS industry as a whole, there really is no conformance test suite for DNS, the protocol. DNS is old enough that, it's literally at this point, not dozens, but we're probably approaching 100 different standards documents that make the entire DNS standard. And the compliance agreements don't require that, for example, a registry conform to all of those. But DNS as a protocol is big enough and sprawling enough that it is very hard to evaluate compliance with every last thing. And the world would be a better place if we had, for example, a standardized test suite. But we don't. So that's why we make it not quite so hard. There is a limited amount of conformance testing that we can do, both from a protocol standpoint to make sure that people are compliant, as well as from an operational standpoint to make sure that they're within certain tolerances, for example.
Thanks, Matt. Let's broaden this a little bit beyond just the infrastructure layer. Do we have any other places where we can test the standards? Should we be testing them? And who should be doing that? I mean, if we think that technology fragmentation is a line that we shouldn't cross, that we shouldn't have technology fragmentation, how do we enforce it? Doesn't it beg the question that we should have some? John?
So I think I would probably answer no. I'm not sure that we should have a standards enforcement agency, because my first question would be, well, so who is that? Is that I would certainly not want the United States government, which I used to work for, doing that. I wouldn't want the United Nations doing that. I'm not sure I would want any government doing that. And so, do we does the ecosystem, would the ecosystem benefit from stronger enforcement of a whole range of particularly security protocols and the like? Absolutely. But I am nervous that kind of going down the path of wanting, not that you're suggesting a regulator, but just kind of, I'm nervous about going down that path. I mean, as kind of Matt, as the ecosystem makes clear, as ICANN makes clear, yes, there are contracted parties, and so there are some enforceable agreements in some areas, but most standards are followed because they are accepted as being the best current technical solution for a situation. And that seems like a pretty healthy way to enforce standards. Now, that again doesn't mean that governments couldn't require companies to follow certain security measures. Again, I wouldn't want the United States government to say, oh, you have to do BGPsec version 3 because, I'm sorry, version 7 is the current one. So again, having a government do that raises concerns.
That's a fair point, that the market's going to shake this out. If this is the most efficient way for the technology to operate, they're going to be rewarded from a commercial standpoint. Yeah. Now, Zach.
And maybe to offer our perspectives from sort of the global standpoint, obviously the more integrated we're getting and the more sort of digital platforms that allow us to sort of get more integrated, we're going to see more disputes. But let us not forget that, the government has been, in terms of like digital taxes, the government has been using, or you can hear me, in terms of digital taxes and the disputes that those have caused, the government has been using particular legal authority, Section 301 of the Trade Act, to address foreign countries or trading partners' anti-competitive practices. So in terms of standards, as standards are being used in sort of anti-competitive ways and ways to limit U.S. Companies' market access, there are tools available right now absent international norm. I don't know, to your point, if an international norm is possible with more and more of the polarization of the global economy, the digital economy, and so we might be finding ourselves in a world where countries are unilaterally resorting to the tools that they have to address foreign countries' uncompetitive practices, then going back to the WTO's countries' commitments, right, for most favored nation, non-discrimination principles. That's the foundation that allows us to use our legal authorities to then impose retaliatory measures against countries that are imposing their domestic laws in a very restrictive way.
That's actually a great segue into the next question. So technical fragmentation entered the news earlier this year, right after the Ukraine invasion, when there was a call to remove the .ru, Russia's country code top-level domain, from the naming system. ICANN is the IANA administrator, the people that have the ability to turn on, turn off such things, did not acquiesce to those calls and said that this was not a good idea. So I'm going to ask a difficult question. Was that the right move? Should we have removed .ru as an appropriate sanction for their behavior?
You're not going to touch that? I can touch it if you want.
Please.
How could you not? How could I not after that? So I think it was unquestionably the right decision. I think everybody knows what ICANN does, but I think for purposes of answering this delicate question, I should be very explicit. ICANN is a technical coordinator of the Internet's unique identifiers, including DNS. And so ICANN, the goal is to increase the security, stability, and resiliency of DNS, because that helps promote the single global interoperable internet that we all want. So in our technical coordination role, ICANN really wants internet technology to not be politicized. Because ICANN was essentially built to make the internet work better, not to use its technical coordination role to make the internet not work. So right now there are just over 350 million domain names registered across all TLDs. So I'd say DNS has been a pretty smashing success with if you go by those numbers, and about 60% of those are names registered in GTLDs. And those fall under the operational policies developed with the multi-stakeholder, community-driven model. So I would say those numbers testify strongly to the success of the multi-stakeholder model. We probably all wouldn't be in the room if we didn't believe that. And the really important thing here is that the multi-stakeholder means that there can't be any unilateral action. So it just simply wasn't an option under the policies that the community has developed for ICANN to take unilateral action and do what had been requested.
Yeah, and there's also, it would have, and it did make some headlines. And yeah, maybe it would have made some headlines. Oh, look, we got ICANN to, punish the bad Russians, which would have impacted them pretty much nothing. And also, there's also kind of the practical side. It's like, oh, we're going to use the DNS to get at pirate content, or we're going to use the DNS for music sharing, or we're going to get at the DNS. We do get at the DNS for command and control for botnets, but again, that's like a minutes thing, then another one pops up. So, whether even if you thought it was a good idea, it would have been a kind of a useless gesture.
I would add, from the Internet Society's perspective, and since I started there less than 3 weeks ago, I'm still learning what the Internet Society actually stands for, but that won't stop me. But certainly the Internet Society thinks that ICANN made the absolutely correct decision. Matt kind of detailed how successful the DNS system is, but what's really striking is that folks are pointing to root servers that ICANN helps administer entirely voluntarily. The decision to say, okay, this is going to be the root server or the root server system that allows us access to across the internet is not foreordained. It's not required, and I do think that if ICANN had gone down the path of saying, okay, we are going to officiate between one nation state that is attacking another nation state and take sides, that I think would do a great deal of damage to the potential for a globally accessible internet.
Melinda, I just want to, in case I hope I heard your question correctly, but in terms of sort of the sanctions, it's really important to stress that the U.S. government recognize the value of open and free and objective information to the people of Russia in case they needed it. And so when they imposed these various sanctions, tranches of sanctions on Russia, they did issue a general license authorizing transactions related to telecommunications and certain internet-based communications, services, software, hardware, technology, incident to the exchange of communications over the internet, in recognition of the fact that the people in Russia needed access to open, objective information from the rest of the world, not just Putin's controlled censorship domain.
Let's stay on this technical fragmentation topic of things that we can turn on and off. In the United States, we have things affectionately referred to as kill switches, and these come into play in the realm of, because we're under an umbrella of cybersecurity, so we're under threat or attack, and it's really a matter of safety. should this be a concept that is expanded out into and more clearly defined in cyber norms and some ground rules related, or is it something that is better left unsaid? Eric.
Yeah, well, and this is something that Matt was getting at too, the technology doesn't know what it's being used for. And because of that, like blanket statements, kick someone off the internet or we're going to cut ourselves off the internet, almost, without the context doesn't mean anything. So for example, if we want to say, and a particular country said this about a decade ago, to us, cybersecurity is protecting our citizens from bad thoughts. Bad thoughts like democracy and, history of uprisings and things like that. And other countries were saying, well, to us, we want to protect our citizens from ransomware and botnets. The solution there is often the same. We're going to cut ourselves off from the other. Yet, when you look at it, as to why you're doing it, and again, in the multi-stakeholder model, we actually do have norms where we say, yeah, it's okay to cut off the source of a botnet, probably not okay to cut off sources of information for citizenry or cut off commerce. So in the US, we have Section 706 of the Communications Act. If you've been longtime Internet Society, it's not 47 CFR 706, because that's get lots of broadband out there. 606 in code 706, which is the president can turn it off. So the president's actually always had, since 1934, the ability to turn off networks, but it's not when she feels like it. It's during a time of war as declared by Congress. So again, we have that authority, but in that limited circumstance.
First, I like to recognize that Eric said she for president, which I really commend, so thank you for doing that. So from my sort of national security vantage point, the U.S. absolutely needs to bolster its response to malicious cyber activity. One thing I've personally been studying is sort of third-party code. You access an internet, it's built off of third-party, fourth-party, whatever code. There's open source code that can have malicious code built into it, right? And so you access an internet website, drops malicious code on your computer, smart homes, electric vehicle charging stations, all of those connect to the energy grid, right? And there's malicious code that could go. And much of this is unregulated, right? Nobody's really paying attention. I mean, how many times is somebody here has heard of third-party code and the fact that pretty much, unless you switch your computers and switch your routers, right, or change the passwords, you're inundated with it all the time. AI is expanding the capabilities, the good, right, and the bad, and the United States is just so far behind addressing these threats. And then here's the sort of the philosophical question. I mean, we're being defensive. The U.S.'s posture is defensive. Do we use the kill switch if everything goes down? But nobody's really talking in a very sort of maybe intellectually robust way about about our offensive capabilities. Why don't we better use our offensive capabilities for deterrence? In the military sector, we're always talking about deterrence through military buildup and our offensive capabilities. But somehow, in this new domain of economic or cyber warfare, we're not talking about that adequately. So I would like sort of the brilliant think tanks of the world and the brilliant strategists of the world and brilliant Eric and the others on the panel to really start thinking and advocating for this other option, right? We will never win in a defensive posture because we're going to be playing whack-a-mole. So we got to think about buttressing our vulnerabilities with an offensive posture.
So Nazak, I'd be happy to debate offensive use of technology, but let me at another time. Your question was kind of most specifically, should we negotiate some norms about kill switches? I think if we're talking about the 706 authority, that's kind of a pointless exercise because the United States would not put constraints on its statutory authority. Thankfully, that's not an authority that that we have used, and frankly, I don't think it's an authority that we will use, because I have a hard time envisioning a cyber attack so broad and massive that, in fact, our private networks aren't able to repel it relatively well. But hopefully, I'm not proven wrong. Should we be negotiating more norms among governments, among countries, about how to better protect the network, how to ensure deployment of needed standards? Yeah, I think that's actually a quite worthwhile thing. But that's not really what you were asking, but kind of taking it a little bit more broadly.
Just it's slightly off topic, but it's so relevant, I felt compelled to talk about it. When we were in the government, we did a lot of these sort of cybersecurity sort of supply chain threat assessments. And something that everybody should keep in mind is that if we were under sort of a significant cyber attack right now, such that our systems needed to be repaired, we have significant supply chain vulnerabilities that would prevent us from repairing our systems. And so as part of sort of the general thinking, I encourage everybody to start thinking and talking about this so that the government could be compelled to move forward with solutions.
Well, I'll talk about another thing that happened during our term. Very closely related to the internet is 5G. 5G is basically, you're breathing the internet now. And we did negotiate international norms on 5G security, and they were 2 pages long. We're not talking about you have to implement this in EPP and that in DNS and the other thing. It was just, again, that high level goals of things that we could all agree to. And, I was even amazed at how quickly many aligned countries signed on, of which supply chain security was one of those bullets there.
Right. Let's transition from technical fragmentation to government fragmentation. So these are the effects of regulations that are put into place that could potentially fragment the internet. Many of these you see are a result of, again, trying to do things that are, they think in the best interest for their country or their citizens. Let's start with privacy. Any organization of any type doing work in the European Union has been dealing with this since 2017 and preparing in advance of that as well with the implementation of the GDPR. Where do we stand at a national level? Should we be following that? Should that be our model? Is what we have going on in Congress right now, this very week, going to be sufficient? Or should we be following some other models? What will help us ease privacy fragmentation?
Being not a lawyer, I'll look at this as a technologist, which is all of the things that we talk about in terms of fragmentation, like GDPR, California privacy. I'll ask Matt, does that affect the internet?
Does what specifically? I'm sorry.
They're all applications. Facebook interoperability, how does that affect the internet?
I don't know that it does.
Well, that's what I would offer, but this is also, because we're the not lawyers here, so it's...
So I actually totally agree that, you're getting up high enough up a stack that, it's not necessarily directly affecting the internet, but I actually think that it can still lead to fragmentation. Let me kind of answer a question as to kind of where do we stand, but I'm going to answer it not with my ISOC hat on, but I'm going to pretend that I still have my Brookings Institution hat on from about 3 weeks ago and say, absolutely, this country needs to get off its rear end and have baseline privacy legislation. And there are a number of models up on the Hill that, and Brookings has put out some good thinking on it. And I think that would actually, help address a range of policy issues that the United States is wrestling with. But I do think that concerns about privacy at a national level can lead to data localization concerns. And once you get to data localization concerns, then you may not be affecting the technical inner workings of the internet at its lowest level, but you are certainly affecting the kind of open access to information that the internet kind of does facilitate or used to facilitate or can facilitate. And certainly the Internet Society would want it to still be able to facilitate.
So I'll offer a few perspectives as well. So obviously the national security risks, right? In terms of not having a cohesive, the national security risks associated with just our data, right? Not being protected and not having a sort of a mature national strategy. There was a Pew Research I was just reading right now, and I don't think enough Americans are really concerned about access to their data. Individually, maybe it doesn't matter. The younger generation is like, it doesn't matter. But the aggregation of data by our adversaries, e.g. China, what they're doing with it, the capabilities, the storing of it to figure out how they can weaponize it as technology matures and develops, that's terrifying. That should cause us to really think about what are the risks, right? We've got to identify the risks and then what we need to do to protect them. GDPR, and technology is developing. GDPR is completely incompatible with the growth of technological development. Blockchain is misaligned with decentralized data handling. And that goes to the next point, which is the U.S. is behind. We're falling behind in terms of technological development vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Digital currency is a perfect example, right? And so whatever kind of regulatory approach that we decide to take has to be address our national security risk, but gosh, we need to give businesses the flexibility to grow, expand, recapture lost market share, grow in market share, because we have to make up for lost time. If we do not win this race, our adversaries will, and the national security implications are disastrous. And then I'll float this idea, which is what I was trying to float when I was in the government, is that, look, let's be clear about what our threats are, right? Do we care if Japan has our data? Do we care if some of our Canadian friends, et cetera, have our data? No, right? We have our economies, our ideologies are so interconnected that the risks are really low. But we've got China, we've got Russia, we've got North Korea, we've got some of these countries that we need to worry about. So I really think we've reached a point. The 90s are over, right? The globalization, everybody's good, it's over, right? We are in a world where it's become increasingly bipolarized, and we need to start labeling friends and adversaries and create a broad ecosystem of data sharing, right? With our allies, that enables us to pull our data sources together, pull our data sets together, and make our AI capabilities that much stronger, and just not do business with our adversaries.
Several good points there. Let's pull some of those threads. So what do we do in the interim? So I don't want to be pessimistic here. It does sound like we are as close as we've ever been on getting a national privacy law. But we all know that Peanuts cartoon and Lucy pulling the football. We live in Washington and it happens all the time. So what do we do in the interim? How is it that we protect ourselves, our citizens and residents, from a widespread collection of data, whether it's, PII, it's location data? What sort of steps should we be taking? And we'll pull one from the headlines, a recommendation that came through the FCC by CAR about saying, look, a big perpetrator of this is TikTok. It's owned by China. They're getting all of this data. Pull it from the App Store was the recommendation there. Is that a feasible recommendation? But in the interim, what do we do?
I'll take that since, from the legal perspective at least. So So we've got CFIUS jurisdiction, right, where we try to prevent transactions into the United States that could access sensitive data, right? And we see that in CFIUS all the time. We have the Information Communications Technology Supply Chain Executive Order that President Trump issued in 2019. Nothing's been really done with it yet. No impeachment of any administration. We didn't move it forward as quickly as we should. We're waiting for the Biden administration, but that gives a really interesting ability for the United States government to restrict transactions that pose data surveillance, private security risks, et cetera. But export controls, right now, data, just people's data, is outside the jurisdiction of U.S. export controls. U.S. export controls, the dual use, extends to goods, software, and technology, but not to data, right? And so what does an export control system look like where now every single person in the United States is subject to compliance? And what does that mean for everybody? What is the government's obligation to make sure that if we, and I think we should, introduce data controls into the export control system, but what does that mean for the average citizen? How would they need to comply? And then what does the government need to do to make compliance easier by, for example, saying, look, we know the Chinese are surveilling everybody through TikTok, so we're not going to be using TikTok. And to the extent that, you use these platforms or Apple or whatever, you offer these platforms that do enable data collection, right? You have to make sure that we just put firewalls. And everybody likes free market, free business, just access, but the world is changing. So we're going to find ourselves in a position where companies, individuals, we're all going to have to put guardrails around the data that is flowing around.
I'll channel Internet Society for you. And that is, we do have very well defined adversaries today. And it's kind of a principle of the United States that we don't pick on a country, even if they are literally an enemy today. We say, don't collect our data, don't use it against us, don't surreptitiously get people to give more, and please, absolutely don't steal our stuff. And then we write our laws that way. I mean, we have written a couple of laws that, in fact, if you look at the laws that were driven by China, they do name China, but it's not China. It's countries that do this, 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 and this. Here's an example, China. And there is that also a bit of careful of what we ask for because we might get it. Because a reasonable person might say, those are the same data collection techniques that YouTube does on their statistics. So, you want to turn one off. Are you saying we want to turn it off because we don't like them? Or do we want to turn it off because we don't like it? Now, as a consumer, I kind of don't like it. And it would be nice to turn them all off. But that's, and that's the thing I think in the United States, because of our data collection-driven commercial interests, we haven't had the discussion. And that's where we then get other countries that have the discussion, and we get kind of stuck with what they've decided without us really talking about it.
Let me jump in. I certainly agree. Thank you very much for, but Nazak, let me just kind of say kind of up front that, I mean, I came out of the public interest community going into government. I certainly thought, even when I was arriving in government, that China was a significant threat. Believe me, I completely believe China is a very significant threat. So my government service has educated me that this country does face very significant threats. But I am concerned about kind of a regime, a path where we pick an app, TikTok, let's just say, and say, we're going to block that app. Because to me, we already have for years been frustrated and unhappy with China blocking our country's apps. At the end of the day, I fear we go down a path toward not having kind of a global ability to kind of exchange information, sometimes using an app that works globally. And I think that there's certainly some in Europe that would be tempted to say, well, heck, let's block YouTube for some of the same reasons. And so I mean, with my Brookings hat on, I say, well, shit, let's pass baseline privacy legislation first, and then let's see what that effect has before we kind of go down that path. But I certainly acknowledge that there are serious concerns and risks about American data increasingly flowing to China. So,
let me just quickly, I mean, yes, I think we all agree, and sort of just maybe timing for the U.S. government action makes a difference, but look, the Chinese state plays a really powerful role in China's digital infrastructure, right? Like, they control the companies. They have all sorts of laws that enable them to control the companies and then punish companies if they don't act in the CCP's best interest. We name China in a whole bunch of our laws, the Consolidation Appropriations Act of 2018, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations, the Information Communications Technology Supply Chain, and the list goes on, right? So, like, I think we've also passed the time where we're going to, like, pretend that we're neutral. We actually are starting to name countries and calling them adversaries, right? Both sides of the aisle. This is a nonpartisan issue. And I think in terms of, I would love to be in a situation where we're not picking apps, because I think it's just whack-a-mole, right? Like, they're always going to be a step ahead. I just don't know the other alternative to how to distinguish safe apps versus non-safe apps when you have a state like China, not exclusively China, where the state has so much control over companies' information and also has a centralized AI sort of system where all of the data gets fed into it, and then they try to figure out how to weaponize it. So it's really not the ideal solution. I concede that completely. But it is, I don't know what else we can do, which goes to the other point. Maybe we do need to share freely with allies and then put guardrails with adversaries. I just don't have any other better solution. And until somebody comes up with that, that's what I'll be advocating.
Let's talk about something maybe a little more, with the chance of being a little more positive. Let's talk about solutions. Everything we're talking about here, whether it's technologists or lawyers negotiating trade agreements, all of these things take and require people. So we have a little bit of a gap here. So let's talk about education and, admit that, that's part of our solution here. What is necessary to develop these sort of capabilities around foreign policy, technology, whether it's security, it's operations, there's any number of umbrellas that fall under that, or the legal work. Can you guys share anything that you know of and efforts that are going in place to sort of beef up this workforce to help us solve these problems?
Well, my day job. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a great one. And there are two parts of it. One is based on doom and gloom, but is actually positive. And even though we like to pick on the phone company, internet people have always been picking on the bellheads, but there was a study done in the 1950s by Bell Labs, and they were looking at their workforce crisis. And their workforce crisis was they had forecasted that they would employ every female in the United States by 1974 to be telephone operators. And it wasn't, oh my goodness, we got to go and train more women, and in fact, we've got to diversify, let some men in. It was, let's invent digital switching. So that's one bit of stuff that's going on right now, a lot of research going on in cybersecurity. How do we automate this? How do we make ourselves less vulnerable? How do we have redundancies in the system so that, yes, when this bit of the power grid goes down, that bit doesn't also go down like it does today? Likewise, education and training. There's a lot of people talking about, oh, well, we need more defenders, more military. In fact, I was having dinner last night with someone who said his son-in-law is in the Army National Guard, and his posting is Fort Meade. And he was kind of saying, well, that's not really, because he was like Army. And I was like, no, today, that is real military where real battles are being fought. And so we talk about how do we train those people? Well, there's a program in the United States called CyberCorps, Scholarship for Service. Basically, 2 years of undergraduates paid for, up to 3 years of undergraduate plus graduate can be paid for. And it's, as the title says, for each year of scholarship you get, you commit to a year of service in the federal executive branch doing something cyber related. The last program that I was part of at Georgetown, only half the students were computer science students. Because yes, we do need people to sit at the keyboards and defend and attack. But the other half were foreign service, government, international affairs, security studies, and law. Because, that is like one of the great distinctions between, in fact, we'll name it, United States and China. If you look at the Cybersecurity Act, that's the thing we keep coming back to. That's the law in China that compels companies to cooperate with the government with anything related to cyber. I've not read the Chinese, I've only read English translations, but it looks pretty identical to CALIA, which is a United States law that gives the United States government the authority to compel the handing over of data. But there's a huge difference. When we say with a legally executed subpoena, we mean it. And so as we get into cybersecurity, we actually need lawyers who understand how the internet works. So we don't get, oh, let's just kick off .ru, that'll solve all our problems. We need policy experts who understand how the internet works. We need people who are going to negotiate these international treaties and norms who understand how things work. So that's programs available. If anyone's interested in grad school or something, come see me.
Matt, were you trying to jump in?
I can just offer that ICANN does our part. We have a capacity building program where we teach about the core protocols and technologies to our mission, and we have, I'm pleased to say, we have multiple people. We have somebody on every continent, so I think we're doing our part.
And certainly the Internet Society is trying to spread around the world greater understanding. But I also, before I went into government, I was an adjunct professor at teaching in law schools. And I was actually trying to develop back then a program that I thought should be mandatory for every single graduating lawyer of just kind of how does the internet work? Because, I mean, even in trust and estates, I don't think there's an area of the law that you don't need to understand things about the internet. And certainly you get into litigation, certainly you get into policy. Just being a good lawyer, you should. But only a few law schools have gone down that path. But I mean, I think we should start in elementary school, but that's,
Well, there's certainly enough cybercrime, which is the next thing we want to talk about briefly. We have an increasing number of cyber threats. It's a high probability that there are several that we are going on right now, and we won't know about them for months. The ramifications are huge, but our ability to seek any sort of resolution and hold people accountable is, of course, limited within the law and the system that we have here and within our bounds. So what can we do to minimize these sort of cyber attacks? And more importantly, what can we do in terms of accountability? Do we do these through trade agreements, other multilateral agreements, other sort of norms? What should we do?
can start with the legal perspective. One of the problems right now is that we keep having these recurrent cyber attacks. A few of the problems is, well, one, they're non-nation state actors. They're very hard to detect, but, absent an extradition treaty, and I firmly believe that we should not have an extradition treaty with the adversaries, absent an extradition treaty with, where we spend millions of dollars prosecuting, right? And we cannot bring these people to justice. And so what? They're going to keep doing it. And so, one, to the earlier point, offensive capabilities. But the United States, for as long as we have it, and I hope we continue to keep this power for a long, long time, our sanctions ability, right? The U.S. control over the global financial system, right? And our ability to sanction these actors, and our ability to work with our partners to make sure that we're on the same page and create some kind of agreement where if our businesses do suffer from any cyber attack and through an investigative thing that we share with our allies, we're able to identify the actors, then we all agree that sanctions are appropriate with us, our trading partners, and our allies. And that really amplifies the power we have as a deterrence. And I think, again, it's a whack-a-mole thing. We're never going to be able to capture everybody or track everything. We're never going to be able to prosecute. But deterrence is powerful, and I would encourage us all to continue to think about interesting ways of deterrence, including sort of coordinating our sanctions capabilities better.
Well, and I think that does hit a very important point, is that the United States has a very broad toolkit. It's not just, oh, they cyber attacked us, we cyber attack them, or they shut us off, we shut them off. We have navies, if you want to get kinetic, air forces, but we also have diplomacy. And, it's pretty powerful when you get a good chunk of the world to say, no, really stop that. And I think although talk about a poor country under cyber attack right now today, but in the long run, it seems Costa Rica has managed to defend itself without a military. And they do it through getting the world. It takes a long time. They suffer greatly, like when they had kinetic attacks. But through the multi-stakeholder model writ large, you can do that, but you're going to starve. And that tends to get government's attention.
So we're going to move on to the third type of fragmentation, commercial fragmentation. And this is also your quick warning. Anybody who has any questions, either online or in the room, we'll be taking those just after this. So commercial fragmentation, it's when we spoke here, the panel as a group, our general, the consensus was that most of what we see examples of commercial fragmentation are really a result of potential or threatened government action. So a little bit of a chicken and an egg issue here. And a really obvious one that comes to mind, and it was discussed in our first panel today, is about content moderation. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I believe Steve said something to the effect that, it only takes about 2 weeks for a really bad law to be enacted in a state. And the reality is, for a business, anybody who's even at the smallest of business, 2 weeks is really not product modification time. It doesn't really give you a chance to write the code, let alone test it and run it through QA and get it implemented. So we have this posture where businesses, and it's really a matter of risk management, have to take action to prepare. But in effect, what is happening here in the United States is fragmentation at a state level. So the question for the panel is, what kind of guidance would you give to businesses right now that are faced with this, this sort of a risk management question? Do you go forward with implementing solutions that you think will be potentially in compliance with the law, even though they might potentially cause some fragmentation? Well, you take a wait-and-see approach.
Well, so I have to be careful because from an ICANN perspective, we are most definitely not in the content business. We are way below that. So my opinion here as a technologist is that I would like to see, so I'm sidestepping your question a little bit, I would not like to see this done via harm to the identifier system, right? I'd like to see this done, to the extent that the sorts of things you're talking about need to happen, I would like to see them done without messing with the single global interoperable namespace that we have managed to create and sustain for so long.
In the old days, I was an actual lawyer instead of really a policy wonk by now. But back then, I successfully litigated a number of cases against state laws aimed at the internet based on simple Commerce Clause obligations. You know, I hope this country is able to get to some national solutions to some of the challenges that are facing our society in the internet context. And I hope that we don't have a state-by-state approach. Now, that's not really any help for a small business who happens to be operating in a state that just passes a law that I might view as a wackadoodle law, but it's still controlling that business. So I'm not really offering that advice, but I do think I think a lot of the state laws that are kind of in discussion now or have been recently passed will ultimately be overturned, which doesn't mean that those states were wrong to try to address a problem, but it would be a lot better at a national level. Not that Congress has shown a lot of ability at taking action. So
I'm going to put my economist hat on and not the lawyer's hat and say, look, technology is evolving and maturing and evolving again so rapidly, and laws are just not keeping up, right? It just takes years or maybe shorter to enact laws, and then to change them is really hard. And so I think states need to understand, lawmakers need to understand that the businesses need going back to the point that we're behind. Businesses need the flexibility to innovate. They need the confidence in the market to be able to innovate, and the investments that we're making right now are able to mature into revenues to then get into better technology and better innovations, that the US government supports them to help them gain market access across the world. So we've got to be flexible. And the reason I made the earlier point about laws take for just a while to change is that we don't know where technology is going to take us 10 years from now. And so we need to have the base level of protections, but allow the technology to grow to mature to a point where we have better visibility into understanding what makes sense to regulate and what makes sense to not regulate. Lawmakers have this problem where if you presume that you know a little bit too much that you do, policymakers, you may overregulate in a way that really shuts down business opportunities. And I am tracking this stuff from a national security perspective and the cryptocurrency and the digital currency and the e-commerce perspective. We have to give our businesses every opportunity to grow, and that means base level of regulations. And this is the other point that I want to make that's really important. I think policymakers need to set ideology aside to take care of the greater good, which is we are in a competition for democracy, and digital platforms are what enables the preservation of democracy, and we need to fight for that.
let me just jump back and just build on what you said. You know, we have seen time and time again proposals up on Capitol Hill, proposals in the states, many of which in the last year or two have been aimed at, you know, the big six or the big five or the big however many, you know, big tech companies. And they make proposals that if those proposals were enacted, all of those big companies would be able to afford to hire 10,000 new employees to comply with whatever proposal, and a lot of smaller competitors wouldn't. And at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of the proposals that are out there, you know, it goes back to your kind of education question. I mean, we don't really have enough understanding within our legislatures to really start to think through, well, what will be the outcome of this? And a lot of proposals aimed at the big companies would end up entrenching the big companies. And so, I mean, we need to think very carefully about what we do.
Well, as a reformed regulator, yeah, as a reformed regulator, or as a regulator, there were a lot of times, and I was, you know, and I believed this in the administration I was in, that, you know, you set the guardrails, and you set the guardrails not necessarily by executive order or law or regulation. You basically say, you know, and then the stuff I was involved with, don't mess with the consumer, right? And for the most part, companies would get it. I think we are where we are, and I think actually, you know, it's like we're willing to name China, and we can name the names of big tech. And the thing is, many people would say they have abused our laissez-faire positioning. And in fact, the reason, especially when we talk about misinformation and disinformation, it's an issue because the platform is so large. And so well, you know, Facebook will hire 1,000 lawyers and 3 people in a garage, you know, they're going to get crushed. There are a lot of laws, a lot of our labor laws say 50 or under, or 100 and under, or 1,000 and under. So the idea, oh, well, we can't possibly tell Facebook to stop making billions of dollars on misinformation because it might hurt innovation is just a non-argument.
I don't disagree at all, but a lot of laws, especially just as one example, laws that say, oh, let's condition Section 230 on doing ABC. Well, that's because they're only focused on the large companies, not recognizing that Section 230 protects millions of companies, millions of individuals. And so certainly I don't at all contest that, you know, Congress could easily say, you know, companies that have X, you know, average monthly users or whatever, I mean, Congress could target something where they see it, but a lot of the proposals haven't been thought through in that manner.
And apologies to a sitting commissioner, but like you said, Congress has to address it. You have to have the proper authorities to fix things.
Thank you. Do we have any audience questions on any type of technical, government, or commercial fragmentation? Do you need a microphone?
I don't want to come up and interrupt. Hi, Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. Since this is about whether the net can survive war, I want to return back to the U.S. statute that applies here. We talked about this a little earlier. Eric mentioned this, Section 706 of the Communications Act, 47 U.S.C. 606. That statute terrifies me. It seems to me to be essentially the Electoral Count Act for the internet and for communications network in general, which is to say that I know what the next Trump administration will do with that statute when given the chance. And the first provision arguably does require an actual declaration of war. It's not necessarily clear that there's a Supreme Court decision that indicates that it would, but note, even then, there's no provision for congressional override. So once Congress has signed that blank check in declaring war, which we know a Republican Congress would, if given the opportunity under another Trump administration. But there's 2 other provisions of that statute that are frankly terrifying. One of them about wireless networks and one about wireline networks. The wireline network does have a congressional safeguard provision. The wireless network part does not. Both of those could be used to shut down American communications networks, not in a state of war, merely upon a declaration of a threat of war or a declaration of national emergency. So my question is, the lawyers have pointed out many of the problems that the statute raises. There have been proposals raised about how to build in safeguards against abuse, including especially that power for Congress to override what the administration does. Not that a Republican Congress would do that, but those have gone nowhere. There seems to be no appetite for fixing this problem because the United States seems to be incapable of fixing problems until it's too late. So my question is, John, you don't seem too worried about this. So maybe you're right. Maybe things will be fine, but maybe they won't. And there's at least a chance that there will be some a terrorist attack or major event under the next administration. And I think we could see something like the misuse of the Electoral Count Act there. So how do we start building safeguards to ensure that a tool like that, which does have a proper purpose, it does need to be in the Communications Act, that isn't abused by the sort of administration that was willing to launch essentially a coup under the last administration?
Well, actually, one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up, with your exception, or the exception of you and people up here, how many people knew that the kill switch was actually in law for almost 80 years? Yeah, that's what I kind of expected. It's not no one given this group, but it's almost no one. And that's like a starting point for the discussion about a kill switch. And I think, your point is very well taken, that it was from a time where it was literally pulling out like a circuit breaker on a submarine cable. And I think it's been more often Democratic, but it also started actually with Republican efforts to rein it in, and nobody's been able to do it. So I don't know.
So Barron, I used to be involved in the conversations about that. So when I was there, you could just trust me. I would take care of it. But I couldn't agree more. I am historically, I don't think we've come close to kind of exercising those powers, at least as far as I can tell. I mean, I obviously have not been there for decades and decades, but I kind of do know some of the internal history, and so I am very nervous about all kinds of potential bad things. I wish Congress would fix and improve a lot of things, including 706. I'm not super optimistic that we're going to make a lot of progress in the next few years. So I'm not saying anything reassuring. I totally agree with you.
I would also argue with my co-panelists here have been in the government, there's enough checks and balances, I think, in the government that I still have, right, some faith that there's not going to be, we're not going to go that far. And I'd be curious to hear others. I'm still confident somewhat in the checks and balances that we currently have in the system.
Yeah, I mean, I can already hear State and Commerce going, hell no, DOD going, oh, we got to, and the president going, what are you talking about? I don't understand this.
Right? Congress is going to intervene and shut this down. But in a number of different ways, right? Congress, because you always are worried about Congress threatening legislation to take powers away, et cetera. And so all of these things are always ever present, and people do think about them. The administration does think about it. Even if you have somebody who's a little bit aggressive, right, like running the country, there's advisors, there's a process that is designed to prevent these types of things from happening. One decision kind of.
Were you around for the last 4 years? Did you see what happened?
Yeah, we were. Yeah, we actually, that's how.
And all we can say is, and you notice the internet didn't get turned off.
Yeah.
So
we were part of the process, and we were the ones who were sort of reining things back where our jurisdiction existed. Now, if you have issues that's not our jurisdiction, that's a separate conversation for something else. But my point is, so far, if it hasn't happened, there is still some checks and balances built in the system.
And let me just say, I completely agree with Nazak that the current systems work pretty well, and that doesn't mean that I don't agree with you, Baron, that I think there is risk, and I think that the last administration, did push some boundaries, but I also think that career staff members were able to work with the White House, and I was a career staff member at the time during the last administration, and were able to get the White House to back away from some ideas that would not have been good. And so I would prefer there to be more guardrails, but it's not actually keeping me up at night, because I actually think the current system, as Nazak said, is okay.
The politicals, we duke things out. The careers are wonderful, but there are also a lot of politicals who we are patriotic and we believe in the right things for the country, and we would duke it out. And we had really tough battles, like with figuratively and almost literally bloodshed. But we were all really believed in doing what was right. And so far, right, sometimes, let's just level set for a second. In the last administration, regardless of what anybody thinks about the president, we had to recalibrate the conversation about our adversaries and about China and national security risks. And the entire world has done a complete 180. And that just doesn't happen with nice talk. You have to get in the room. You have to have your gloves off. You have to duke it out. When we're recalibrating the global world order in such an unprecedented way, you had to kind of pull one extreme for the pendulum to start kind of swinging in the middle. It's growing pains, and it's part of democracy, and it's part of the debate that we all sort of embrace.
I'm going to let it stand there, although I think I'll keep sharing raised eyebrows of concern with Baron. I think we were maybe only possibly, just because somebody never mentioned the kill switch, away from a kill switch being implemented. We don't know. Any other questions? Roger.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm an engineering and management consultant. What can be done to get more use of the internet in communities and getting them to make transparent decisions on their spending and get people participating?
Well, there's this awesome model of giving people, actually, a lot of your stuff is a lot of what's coming out now in decentralized organizations. This is part of why, ICANN works on getting a lot of infrastructure out there. I've been working a lot on 5G because participatory government through the internet has been a thing we've talked about forever, but until you have ubiquitous access, it goes from internet being something that helps your education, helps your economy, all that, to you're kind of required to have it to participate in the government. And so I think a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about with getting a free and open internet out there so that you could do things like enabling local government, more transparency. How much transparency happened from the PEG channels? And can we do more of that now? And I think, a lot of the stuff you've been looking at could be ways for it.
I would just add, I couldn't agree more that is a critical goal. In the United States, I'm hopeful that my former agency, NTIA, which is now trying to hand out $48 billion to try to address access in America, I hope they're very, very successful. My new organization, Internet Society, just today, literally today, went live with a community network that ISOC financed and helped to build. We believe it is the highest elevation computer network, community network in the world. It's at something like 3,400 meters in a Sherpa community in Nepal. And, where ISOC is building, lots of community networks, building internet exchange points. And except that effort, ISOC, unlike the $48 billion, which has a chance to make a real dent in the United States, around the world, that is just a huge effort. And so I actually would encourage, our government to start helping in foreign aid to help fund internet access, which China has been very, very effective at in their Belt and Road policies.
We haven't been very good at giving alternatives to China. And so China's been very creative at figuring out ways to provide alternatives to the rest of the world. And there's mechanisms that we can draw from, blueprints where we have successfully integrated, right, with allies. And we need to really start thinking seriously about even the countries that aren't high priority right now. China's growing in, and they have no other alternative, and the U.S. needs to be present, and we need to make resources to be present.
Any other questions? Good. Great. Well, it sounds like we certainly have a lot of work to do and some areas to improve our efforts to limit fragmentation where it's trouble and to protect ourselves, because there's certainly any number of vulnerabilities that we've covered here today. So I want to thank our panel for joining us today for this great conversation. And thank all of you for coming. Please, Chris.
And one more thank you to our sponsors. We have Amazon, Aaron, AT&T, the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law, Comcast, NBC Universal, ICANN, Identity Digital, who sponsored the captions that we have today, Lumen, NetChoice.us, who sponsored our coffee break, .org, US Telecom, VeriSign, and we have Stake Investor Relations, who provided some media support, and Broadband Breakfast as a media sponsor as well. And also just want to say thank you to McKenna Bachman in the back, who's really been working behind the scenes for the past 3 years to make all these things happen. It's been a great intern and fellow for the IGF-USA. So, and thank you to everyone who helped organize this, and thanks for hanging out so long.
We'll see you on the internet. And for now, we'll see you for drinks.